Yeah, she absolutely had a favorite. It was Charles. And
Gareth, so excited to chat with you. Congratulations. The book is out. Let's have another drink, all about the Queen Mother. It is an absolute fantastic read. So why did you want to take a deeper dive into the Queen Mother's life?
Oh, thank you so much. It has been sort of incredible how I've been very grateful with how it's been received. I grew up, I was young when the Queen Mother was in the final stage of her public life, and my late grandmother adored her and used to tell very funny stories about her. There was a sense of her, the mischief and her enjoyment of life. And so when I was thinking about what to do next, I just finished a pretty serious book. I thought, well, everything around us at the minute can be a bit grim, and maybe it'd be quite interesting to look at a figure that had a sort of zest for life and to write a book that's a little bit of a different way of writing a biography. This is 101 anecdotes. So it's sort of a love letter to people who love shows like Downton Abbey and The Crown, but also people who want to dip in and find little anecdotes that they can tell over dinner parties or laugh at or be informed by. So that's really why the structure is a bit different as well.
Yeah, I love that.
Yes, we loved the short story structures where, like you said, it's sort of short, brief, little funny anecdotes. One of the ones that I liked was that she was late to her own christening. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, she was famously averse to punctuality, and her daughter Elizabeth II was really, particularly, and her son-in-law Prince Philip. Prince Philip believed in like naval military timing. And he found his mother-in-law's flagrant disregard for the clock quite infuriating. But it started young. She was her and her father Claude, Lord Strathmore. They just thought that registering things on time was a bit boring, and that they everything was late. And it really was only when the local vicar said, that you need to put the paperwork in, that the family thought, oh yeah, we should probably get round to actually filling out the paperwork. And Elizabeth used to joke, technically she was late to her own christening because her father, like her, had a relaxed attitude towards the strictures of time.
I love that. What was also so interesting is the early relationship of the Queen Mother and King George. And she really wasn't that interested in him at the beginning, correct?
No, there was this sort of weird myth that grew up based on gossip that she actually was secretly in love with his elder brother. And in fact, what I found out, being able to access diary records and letters from the time, was the exact opposite. She was not interested in marrying a royal at all. She told her younger brother, David Bowes-Lyon, that she felt that it would be giving up any semblance of privacy, that she would be married to the country for the rest of her life. And she turned down the future king. She didn't know he was going to be king at that point, but she turned down her future husband twice. It was third time's the charm for her husband. When he proposed in January 1923, she said yes. And her feeling, the first time, I think she hadn't really had those feelings, romantic feelings for him. And she also did not want to marry into the royal family. By the second proposal, she seems to have had much stronger feelings for him, but was still a bit iffy about marrying into the royal family. And then by the third proposal, it was the sweet spot, and she said yes.
I love that. So funny.
I think that's so funny. He probably had to talk her into it, and saying like, "You'll never see the throne. It's fine."
Yeah,
and then,
yeah.
Few years later. And on to that, is it true that David only gave them 72 hours notice that he was abdicating the throne? Yeah,
I think, and so first of all, there's this it's part of the the power of movies. We all imagine her sitting around the radio hearing David's announcement that he was giving up the throne. She actually was bedridden during the abdication crisis with pretty bad pneumonia. And was very, very unwell. And so she was very sick. And they had started to suspect that something, they'd been worried about him as king for months. But they came down, so just as she was falling sick, they came down from Scotland and got off the train in London, and journalists were asking them questions. Was it true that the king was going to give up the throne? She gets home, gets into bed, tries to recover, and her husband's trying to phone his brother and get in touch with him and sending letters, sending messengers, telegrams, everything. Can you tell us what's going on? And 3 days before, David tells him, by the way, 3 days' time, I'll be giving it all up and you will be the next king and emperor. And so she really took The idea of her brother-in-law giving up the throne was against everything she really believed in. She had very sort of conservative attitudes towards duty and the monarchy. But there was also an element of personal resentment that she had been sick and that they'd been given less than half a week notice, what most people get a lifetime to prepare for.
God, I couldn't even imagine.
Yeah.
So how did she kind of fall into the role then? Did she embrace it? Was she resentful for it at first?
It was sort of both. I think fall into it actually is the perfect way to describe it. She had to pretty much drag herself out of her sick bed. And she took her husband and daughters to Sandringham, to their estate in Norfolk, where they usually spend Christmas. This was a very quiet Christmas. It sort of intervened to cancel the Christmas radio broadcast, it was then. And she spent more or less a month trying to stave off her husband's complete nervous breakdown. And she really didn't, it was a horrendous month for her. And I think because she was so focused on him, it didn't dawn on her. It really, to me, it took months for her to kind of start to process that she become queen consort with that level of, or lack of warning. And you start to see, initially, she writes a letter to her brother-in-law when he leaves saying, you're in our prayers. We wish you all the best in your future life. But it's sometimes, you have an argument, and then it's only when you sit and think about it, you start to form much tougher opinions. Then by the spring of 1937, she was done with the brother-in-law. I think that's when she said that she had got her confidence and also slightly recovered from the shock of what had happened. But unlike her husband, she was a people person. She could talk to anyone. Her critics nicknamed her Grinning Liz, because she sort of went over to anyone and spoke to them and smiled, and she was very popular. So I think in that sense, she was someone reviewed the book, and I can't remember who it was, but it was sent to me, and I thought, well, that's actually a perfect way to describe her, which is it's someone who didn't want the limelight, but once she was in it, never wanted to leave it.
Interesting.
I think that's a good description of her.
Yeah.
I love the relationship between Queen Elizabeth and her husband, and what a good balance that they were. She was very, sort of chatty. She was a people person, whereas he was
Absolutely.
not. He was sort of reserved. But after his death, so much changed for her, and she was really quite young when she became a widow. Can you tell us more about what her life looked like?
The grief she felt is really moving. She this idea that she was quite cold and didn't have any emotions is completely untrue. She just didn't show them all the time, or certainly not publicly. But she's writing these really heartbreaking letters about how she'll never be happy again, and she'd be married to a man who put everyone else first but himself. And she says grief knocks you about until you've almost forgotten who you are. That was really a moving part of the book to research and write about. But she was young. She was 51 when she was left a widow, and initially it does look like she was so heartbroken that she was thinking of retiring from public life, until Winston Churchill stepped in and spoke to her and said, you're so popular. What he said was, your country still needs you, ma'am. But how he put it to her was that you're so popular that you still have a role to play in being a senior working royal. And so by the end of the year, her husband died in February, there were a couple of points where she wobbled and really was struggling with grief. But by the end of the year, she was back, performing public engagements. And she said later that meeting people is good for me. That's what helped her get over it. And she said, I love people. And I think that was the key to her, to how she was able to enjoy being a working royal for the next 50 years.
Yeah. And how was she there for Elizabeth during this time too? Because obviously she lost her father, but she's also queen in the same, with no notice as well.
So I think, Elizabeth II really had, and she said it herself, that she was so busy becoming monarch and planning the coronation of 1953, whereas her mother and her sister, Princess Margaret, were really dealing with a much quieter time when their grief felt more all-encompassing. But one of the things that really surprised me was just how much of a close advisor to Elizabeth II the Queen Mother was. If they weren't together, they spoke on the phone 2 or 3 times a day. In every major crisis, Elizabeth II consulted her mother. And they also, one thing that I found quite fun was that the Queen, Princess Margaret, and the Queen Mother would try to meet as often as possible for lunch as just the 3 of them, when they would talk in French to keep up their language skills.
So fun.
That's really lovely. What type of grandmother was she? I know we hear a lot about that, but did she have any favorites? Are there any special stories?
Yeah, she absolutely had a favorite. It was Charles. And she was a very affectionate grandmother to them all, and she really got on, actually, I should say, very, very well with Princess Margaret's son and daughter. And in fact, Lord Linley, Princess Margaret's son, used to take his mother and the Queen Mother driving in a sports car around London in disguise. The Queen Mother would put on a headscarf and sunglasses so no one would recognize her. She was whizzed around the streets in a convertible. But no, she really was very protective of Charles, partly because he was her first grandchild, and also because she was determined that there would never again be a king who would come to the throne with the lack of self-confidence that her husband had. Her husband really had a very difficult relationship with his father, King George V, who was quite tough on him, very rules-driven, not very affectionate with his children, particularly his sons. And the Queen Mother really did feel that had left her husband emotionally weakened in terms of adopting a public life of service and a life in the public eye. And she was determined that was not going to happen to Charles III, what happened to George VI. So she made a special effort to spend time with Charles and to increase his confidence. And also, from a biographical detail, she really spent a lot of time with Charles and Princess Anne because they were so young when their grandfather died and their mother became queen. And the Queen and Prince Philip were then off on tour a lot. And when they went, it was thought, the wisdom at the time was that children shouldn't go on those tours because it was too disruptive for a child's routine. So the children, Charles and Anne, were pretty much left with the Queen Mother. And in many ways, they were brought up by her. To a large extent, the Queen Mother was a major figure in both Anne and Charles's life. She also, when she died, the then Prince Charles gave this very emotional public tribute to her, where he said, that she had the most extraordinary zest for life and sense of humor, and he would miss their laughs. And in fact, this summer, not long before he became king, he was camera and mic picked up. He was at the Braemar Games in the Highlands, and he told a fellow attendee, I used to come here every year with my grandmother, and I still miss her. So it was a close relationship.
For more news content and exclusive interviews, make sure to hit the sub, like, and bell button down below, and visit usmagazine.com.